The wind howled like a wolf starved for bone, tearing at the single-wall cabin like a living, malicious thing. Elias Thorne sat by the dying fire, the silence inside broken only by the groan of timber and the rhythmic scrape of snow against glass. Outside, the blizzard had raged for 3 days, burying the world in white, isolating his small ranch from everything but the fury of the elements. He was used to the solitude, preferred it, truth be told. People were fickle, unreliable. The land was harsh but honest. He hadn't expected company. Not ever again. The pounding came first, a desperate, fumbling sound against the thick door, almost lost in the storm's roar. Elias froze, hand instinctively reaching for the rifle leaning against the hearth. It wasn't human, surely. A branch? A lost animal? He waited, listening. It came again, weaker this time. A sound that held the unmistakable, terrifying frailty of something alive but barely. Hesitantly, he rose, rifle ready, moving through the dim cabin. The window beside the door was thick with ice, but he peered through a scraped-away patch. A shape, slumped against the wood, shrouded in white, indistinct but undeniably human. A wave of reluctance, cold as the air seeping under the door, washed over him. Compassion was a vulnerability he couldn't afford. Yet the sound, it hadn't been demanding. It had been pleading. With a grunt, he unbarred the door, wrestling it inward against the drift. The wind screamed, throwing snow into the cabin. And then she fell inward, a bundle of frozen cloth and ice, collapsing onto his floorboards. Elias slammed the door shut, leaning against it, gasping for breath in the sudden calm eye of the storm's entry. She lay still, face hidden by a hood stiff with ice. Elias knelt, his movements cautious. He peeled back the hood, revealing a young woman's face, pale and drawn, eyes closed, lips tinged blue. Snowflakes melted on her cheeks like cold tears. Her clothes were thin, inadequate for this weather, ripped in places. A cheap, worn saddlebag lay half-buried in the snow she'd brought in. He felt no immediate surge of pity, more a weary resignation. This was complicated, dangerous. A woman alone, found half-dead on his isolated ranch in a blizzard. It invited questions he didn't want to answer, problems he didn't want to solve. But she was alive, barely. His gaze lingered on the faint flutter of her eyelids, the shallow rise and fall of her chest. The stark, undeniable reality of her vulnerability chipped away at his reserve. He couldn't leave her, not like this, roughly, but with a surprising lack of awkwardness. He lifted her, carrying the light, unresponsive weight to his cot by the fire. He worked quickly, peeling away the frozen layers of her clothes, his hands rough but careful not to injure. Her skin was deathly cold. He wrapped her in thick wool blankets, piling them high, stirring the fire back to life until the small cabin felt almost warm. He brewed strong, hot tea, adding a touch of his precious whiskey, and managed to get a few drops between her lips. He watched her through the long night, the storm still raging outside. Her breathing remained shallow, sometimes catching in a ragged gasp. She shivered uncontrollably beneath the blankets. He sat in his chair, rifle still within reach, his gaze fixed on her still form. Who was she? Where had she come from? What desperation had driven her out in such a storm? These questions circled his mind, but he pushed them away. Survival was the only question that mattered now. Hers, and by extension, his own complicated peace. The silence that had been his comfort now felt brittle, invaded by the soft, vulnerable sounds of her struggle for life. He felt a stir of something unfamiliar, unsettling. Responsibility. She woke slowly, disoriented, eyes fluttering open to the rough log ceiling. Fear flashed in them first, raw and immediate, before she registered the warmth, the firelight, the rough blankets. Her gaze darted around the small cabin, landing on Elias sitting across the room, watching her with an unreadable expression. She flinched, pulling the blankets tighter around her. She looked fragile, small against the piled wool. Elias didn't speak, didn't move, giving her space. He knew that look, the look of someone cornered, ready to bolt or fight. He waited. After a long silence, her eyes, a startlingly clear gray in the dim light, met his again. The fear was still there, but now mingled with a deep exhaustion, a hint of wary intelligence. Where? Her voice was a dry whisper, barely audible. My place, Elias said, his voice low and gruff. Thorn's Ranch. Storm brought you. She closed her eyes for a moment, a tremor passing through her. The memory seemed to settle, and she opened her eyes again, the fear sharpening. I need to go, she tried to push herself up, but fell back with a weak gasp. You're not going anywhere, Elias stated flatly. Not in this weather. Not like this, he gestured vaguely at her wrapped form. You were half frozen. She didn't argue, just watched him. Her gaze steady despite her weakness. Elias saw the intelligence there, the assessment. She was calculating, deciding. He poured her some of the tea from a pot kept warm on the hearth, added a little sugar. He carried it over, offering the tin cup. She hesitated for a moment, then reached out a hand that still trembled slightly, taking the cup. Her fingers brushed his, and he felt the lingering chill. She drank slowly, her eyes scanning his face, his cabin. He saw her taking in the sparse, functional furnishings, the rifle, his own weathered, solitary appearance. She didn't speak, didn't offer thanks. It wasn't rude. It felt more like she was conserving every ounce of strength, every word. He sat back down, leaving her to her tea. The silence returned, different now. Not empty, but watchful. Elias felt a reluctant curiosity stir. She wasn't what he'd expected. Not a helpless waif, despite her condition. There was a resilience about her, a hard edge beneath the vulnerability. Over the next few days, as the blizzard slowly abated, she remained largely silent. She accepted the food he offered, thick stew, hard biscuits, coffee, eating sparingly but without complaint. She slept a lot, her breathing gradually deepening, her color returning. When she was awake, she watched him, her gaze often resting on his hands, his movements. She seemed to be studying him, learning his rhythms. He learned a little about her, too, not from words but from observation. She was young, perhaps early 20s. Her hands, though currently raw and chapped from the cold, showed signs of hard work. There was a weariness in her eyes that was too old for her years. She didn't ask questions about him or his life. It was a mutual, unspoken agreement to exist alongside each other, for now. He found her saddlebag where it had fallen. It contained little of value. A few coins, a worn change of clothes, a cheap, battered harmonica, and a small, leather-bound journal tucked deep inside. He hesitated, then put it back, unopened. Her privacy, minimal as it seemed, felt important. One afternoon, when she was strong enough to sit up for a while, she spoke, her voice still a little rough. My name's Clara. Elias nodded. Elias. Another silence. Then she asked, how much? She didn't finish the question, but gestured around the cabin. Payment. Elias looked at her. She had nothing, and the thought of payment felt wrong. Nothing, he said. Just stay out of the way till you're fit. She nodded, her gaze searching his. It was a small step, this exchange of names, this acknowledgement of her debt and his dismissal of it. A fragile thread spun between them in the quiet, firelit cabin, while the last winds of the storm whispered outside. The space she occupied, physical and otherwise, was beginning to feel less like an intrusion and more like presence. Unsettling, yes, but no longer entirely unwelcome. As Clara regained her strength, she didn't demand or complain. Instead, she began to observe the routines of the cabin. She watched Elias Mentak, split wood, cook his simple meals. One morning, without a word, she carefully folded the blankets she had been sleeping in. The next day, she rose before him and, moving stiffly, began to sweep the cabin floor with a worn broom. Elias, emerging from his small sleeping corner, stopped and watched her. Her movements were slow, deliberate, but there was a quiet determination in them. He felt a prickle of something he couldn't name. Not gratitude exactly, more like acknowledgement. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't a burden who simply consumed. She was trying to contribute in the only ways available to her in this unfamiliar space. He didn't comment, just went about his own tasks. But later that day, when he was struggling with a stubborn buckle on a bridle, she came over and, with quiet competence, took it from him, her fingers quickly and deftly working the leather and metal. She finished in moments, handing it back with a faint, almost imperceptible nod. Her eyes met his, and in that brief exchange, there was no debt, no fear, just a shared understanding of competence. She knew how to work with her hands. Elias found himself watching her more. He saw her looking out the small window at the snow-covered landscape, a faraway look in her eyes. He saw her pick up the battered harmonica from her saddlebag once, turning it over in her hands, but she didn't play it. The sadness in her seemed deep-seated, a quiet ache she carried. He didn't push her for her story. His own past was a locked box, and he respected the boundaries she seemed to have drawn around hers. Their communication remained minimal, functional. Questions about tasks, simple observations about the weather. Yet, the shared tasks, the quiet presence in the small cabin, began to build a different kind of connection. A foundation of unspoken trust built on action, not words. One afternoon, Elias was hauling water from the partially frozen well. It was backbreaking work. As he strained with a heavy bucket, Clara emerged from the cabin, bundled in one of his spare coats that was far too large for her. Again, without asking, she simply took the other bucket from him, dipped it, and began to haul. She was slight, and the effort clearly taxed her, but she didn't falter. They worked together in silence, the rhythm of the rope and bucket the only sound besides the wind. When the trough was full, she stood there, catching her breath, her cheeks flushed with the cold and effort. Elias looked at the full trough, then at her. "You didn't have to do that." "Needed doing," she replied simply, her gaze steady. He nodded, a rare gesture of acceptance from him. "I needed doing." He noticed her looking at his few head of cattle, huddled miserably in the makeshift shelter he'd built for the storm. They were thin, the winter had been long and hard. Later, he found her standing near the corral fence, watching the animals with a thoughtful expression. When he approached, she didn't startle. "They're weak," she said, her voice quiet. "Need better shelter, more feed." Elias shrugged, his usual stoic response. "Doing what I can. Winter's lean." "I know horses better," she said, looking away towards where his one aging mare was kept. "But cattle, you can lose them fast in the spring thaw, if they're too weak." It wasn't a criticism, just an observation. An observation from someone who clearly understood the harsh realities of ranching. He looked at her, this young woman who had arrived frozen at his door, now talking about the health of his herd. The contrast was stark. The world outside his cabin was slowly coming back to life as the snow melted, revealing the muddy, brown earth beneath. And the world inside was changing too. Clara's presence was no longer just a vulnerability he had to protect. It was becoming a quiet strength alongside his own. She wasn't asking for rescue. She was simply enduring, contributing, existing. And in doing so, she was chipping away at the walls he had built around himself. Walls that had stood for so long he'd forgotten they were there. The arrival of the first thaw brought not only mud and the promise of spring, but also the reemergence of the world Elias had sought to escape. Word, as it always did, traveled. A lone woman found at Thorne's isolated ranch. Whispers started, carried on the wind from distant neighbors and passing riders. Whispers of suspicion, of impropriety, of what a man like Elias Thorne might be hiding. Elias ignored it at first. He'd always been an outsider, used to being judged. But the looks from the few people he encountered on supply runs grew colder, the distance they kept wider. Then came the day Jebediah Shaw, a neighboring rancher known for his cruelty and avarice, rode onto Elias's property. Shaw was a man who saw vulnerability as an opportunity, and the situation with Clara was, in his eyes, a glaring one. Elias met him outside the cabin. Shaw stayed mounted, looking down, a sneer twisting his face. Behind him sat two of his rough hired hands. "Heard you got yourself some company, Thorne?" Shaw drawled, his eyes flicking towards the cabin. Elias stood tall, arms crossed. "My business, Shaw." "Maybe," Shaw said, dismounting slowly. His eyes were hard. "Or maybe it's everyone's business when a man's hiding things. A young woman like that, alone. Seems peculiar." He took a step closer, his voice dropping slightly, though loud enough for his men to hear. "Folks are talking, Thorne, asking questions. Might be easier if you just turned her over. For her own protection, o' course. And yours." The implication hung heavy in the air. Shaw intended to profit from whatever secrets Clara might hold, and removing her would also weaken Elias, making his land a potential target. Elias felt the familiar surge of anger, cold and contained. But before he could respond, the cabin door opened, and Clara stepped out. She stood there, small but straight, facing Shaw and his men. She wasn't wearing Elias's oversized coat today, but her own clothes, cleaned and mended with surprising skill. She looked pale, still a little thin, but her stance was defiant. Her gray eyes met Shaw's with a chillingly calm intensity. "I came of my own will, sir," she said, her voice clear and steady, devoid of fear. "Mr. Thorne saved my life. I am his guest." Shaw's sneer widened. "Guest? Or captive? Heard you were found half dead in the snow. Seems like you might be beholden to him. Maybe he's keeping you." Clara took a step forward. "He offered me shelter when no one else would," she said, her gaze unwavering. "He has treated me with nothing but respect." She paused, then added, her voice gaining a steel Elias hadn't heard before. "I would advise you to leave his property." Shaw laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Advising me? A slip of a girl? You got spunk, I'll give you that. But Thorne, you know the rules. A lone woman, no papers, showing up out of nowhere. Authorities will have questions. Maybe we just save everyone the trouble and take her in now." He motioned to his men. As they started forward, Elias stepped in front of Clara. His hand went to the rifle he now held loosely. "She stays," he said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute finality. "Any man who tries to take her will have to go through me." Shaw hesitated, looking at Elias's face, the set of his jaw, the cold, dangerous look in his eyes. He was a bully, not a fool. Elias Thorne might be isolated, but he was known to be capable and driven to desperate measures when provoked. Shaw weighed the potential cost against the uncertain reward of taking Clara. His gaze flickered back to Clara, who stood behind Elias, her presence a quiet, unwavering force. He saw something in her eyes that gave him pause. Not just defiance, but a deep, still reserve of strength. She wasn't the broken creature he'd imagined. With a final glare, Shaw spat on the ground. "This ain't over, Thorne. Folks around here don't take kindly to secrets. Or strays." He turned and remounted, his men following suit. They rode off, leaving the silence behind them humming with tension. Elias lowered the rifle, his knuckles white. He turned to Clara, expecting fear, thanks, maybe tears. Instead, she simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said finally, quietly. He nodded, unable to form words. She didn't retreat into the cabin. She stood there, beside him, looking out at the retreating figures. In that moment, facing down the external threat, something shifted between them. It wasn't just him protecting her anymore. It was them together facing the world. Her vulnerability had not made her weak. It had revealed a core of resilience he had never encountered before. And in defending her, he had defended something within himself he hadn't realized was worth protecting. The confrontation with Shaw cemented their fragile bond. It was no longer just about survival. It was about a shared defense against a hostile world. Clara didn't flee after Shaw left, though Elias half expected her to. Instead, her quiet presence seemed to deepen, settle. She didn't offer much about her past, and Elias didn't press. But the little she revealed, the weary lines around her eyes, the way she sometimes flinched at sudden loud noises, hinted at hardship far beyond a blizzard. She continued to help, her contributions growing beyond simple chores. She had a remarkable affinity for the animals. Elias watched, astonished, as she calmed his skittish mare with soft words and gentle hands, a skill he had never mastered. She knew about tending wounds, about predicting weather shifts. She saw things he missed, details about the land, the livestock that spoke of a deep, intuitive connection to the natural world. He started talking to her, really talking, for the first time in years. Not about his past, not yet, but about the ranch, the land, the challenges of making a life here. He found himself listening to her observations, her quiet insights. She didn't fill the silence with idle chatter. She filled it with substance, with a shared understanding of their harsh reality. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the conversation drifted to the future. The ranch was struggling. The long winter, the poor pasture, the low prices for cattle. Elias was tired, worn down by the endless struggle. "It's hard," he admitted, the words feeling strange and heavy on his tongue. "Getting harder. Maybe it's time to let it go." Clara looked into the fire. "This land," she said softly, "it's got bones, good bones. It just needs care. The right kind of care." She looked at him, her gray eyes steady. "I know horses. I can work them. I can help with the cattle. We can try different things. Better feed. Building up the soil. Takes time. But it can be done." Elias was silent, absorbing her words. "We?" he finally asked, the word foreign and unexpected. Clara met his gaze directly. "If you'll have me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't have anywhere else to go. And I like it here. The quiet, the work." And she hesitated, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "You saved my life. You stood up for me." In that moment, Elias saw not the frozen, vulnerable woman who had collapsed on his floor, but a partner, someone forged by hardship, resilient and capable. She wasn't asking for rescue. She was offering a partnership, a shared burden, a shared future on the land that had always been his solitary world. His life, which had been a landscape of stark, unchanging solitude, suddenly felt vast with possibility. Clara, lost and found in the storm, hadn't just survived. She had brought a quiet transformation. She hadn't filled a void, but had shown him the spaces within himself that could be filled, not with loneliness, but with connection, with purpose beyond mere endurance. He looked at the firelight playing on her face, seeing the strength, the resilience, the quiet hope she embodied. His stoic facade cracked, revealing a vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself in years. "Yes," he said, the word a quiet exhale of acceptance. We can try." The world outside his cabin remained harsh, the challenges ahead immense. But the howling wind no longer felt like the sound of his own isolation. It was just wind. And inside, the silence was no longer empty. It was shared. Clara had arrived as a ghost of the storm, but she had become the quiet, steady heart of his home, transforming his solitary existence into a life built on mutual respect, shared resilience, and the quiet, enduring strength of two souls found and forged in the wilderness. The young woman, lost in the blizzard, had not just survived. She had rebuilt a life, not just her own, but his, piece by careful piece, into something unexpectedly strong and profoundly hopeful.